Today, I'm going to read stories from a script. So I do have a book that I will read stories from. I'll do it in the same sing-songy voice that I do for my children. It seems to work. It'll put them to sleep, puts you to sleep. Should be okay. The trick will be not upsetting the computer as I turn the pages. But I'll make you two promises. The first is that I will only use profanity when I'm quoting others. And second, that I will tell you 50 short stories with an emphasis on short. They'll give you some insight into my development as a zygote, or from zygote, to my current role as type designer at Monotype. I hope they'll be informative, and I pray they'll be at least mildly entertaining and truthful. So, story number 50. History, Forms, and Use. Mr. Daniel Berkeley Updike was the son of English parents and a fine Boston printer and type historian. His 1922 two-volume collection, Printing Types, is fairly exhaustive and fairly exhausting. I highly recommend reading at least its subtitle, Their History, Forms, and Use. This is the trinity of typography: studying type, designing type, and using type. If I stare at the screen, it's because I love really big type. It's just, I always have. It's all I can do not to leap over this transom and start hugging type. I didn't pattern my career on Updike's subtitle, but it does reflect this trinity. So I've taught type. I design type every day, as Matteo said, and I've designed some hundreds of books. I come from a long line of smartasses, and here I'm quoting. My father, once this fresh-faced, charming boy, studied letterpress printing in high school. At his first job as an apprentice to a printer of church books, he was left in charge of a Miller Simplex cylindrical press, which is that press, while the owner stepped outside to have a smoke. Things went smoothly for a bit. Sheets rolled through the press. The impression was good. The packing was spot on. And the gas flame dryer at the end of the press was drying the sheets. Yes, paper plus open flame. Soon enough, Pages jammed the dryer, and his boss came in to find the press on fire, and he began immediately pulling flaming sheets from the oven and stomping them out. My father stood watching, and his boss screamed, and here I quote, "Don't just stand there, do something." His boss seemed to have the situation well under control, and so my father, rather nonchalantly, began dancing a sort of jig. This, despite what you might expect, made his boss smile. His boss here is played by Oscar Hammerstein. Such is my father's charm. A printer's devil, as you may know, is a dirty little child who does odd jobs in a print shop. My father had an offset printing press in our basement. And as soon as I was able to stand, he let me crack reams of paper and load them into the feeder. Printer's ink, I'm convinced, is equal parts pigment and virus. And the virus portion moves through the skin very quickly. I was infected as a printer's devil, and I've certainly infected others. And my youngest brother, a printer by trade, was infected worst of all. With a printing press in our basement, it was common in my family to check the registration and line screen in the newspaper. With Christmas only 9 months away, I recommend a printer's loop for all the children on your list. This one especially, is a beautiful tool and an excellent toy. My mother was an excellent stripper, probably as good as any I've ever worked with in New York. She did most of her stripping on a light table in our dining room. Stripping is, of course, the very precise job of assembling film negatives for the production of offset printing plates. She retired from stripping about 5 years before the title changed to the much more mundane film assembly person. Nonetheless, I can confidently and proudly say that my mom was the best stripper in our neighborhood. Oh, that's a stripper, sorry. Jesus Christ. My mother, the stripper, is a devout Catholic. Despite this, and because of this, she's a skilled artist and calligrapher. Here, 3 penguins inspect the holiness of her illustration with a backdrop of her half-unchal. Each week during the 1970s, she designed and sewed banners for the altars at church, dozens in all. In form, they were like the banners carried by Roman legions or crusading hordes. In style, they ranged from Alexander Gerard to Fillmore West to Mary Blair to Rankin and Bass. Here, I've reconstructed one from memory. My mom says not a good reconstruction, but from memory. Testimony to her charity and humility, only one tiny faded banner survives. Sister Susan Corrigan was a singing nun, not a hitting nun. She taught me handwriting in 1st grade. In 2nd grade, I transferred to public school for 2 years. Miss Bernardi admonished me for my humanist lowercase t. The public schools, it turned out, favored the more economic geometric style. In the 4th grade, back in Catholic school, I checked out the same 20 books in rotation over the course of the year. Harbingers of my professional life, they were a semi-fictional biography of Benjamin Franklin and the entire Life Nature Library. University Roman. The 1970s in America forever transformed the word classy into a one-word oxymoron. Our dining room / stripping room had sheets of press type and letraset for the occasional headline and photo credit. As a result of these 2 circumstances, the first typeface I knew by name was University Roman. And it is still so classy. Sister Helen was a hitting nun, not a singing nun. She taught me how to diagram sentences in the 6th grade. It's an archaic skill, but something that prepared me well for my decades in publishing and typography. I'm no sadist, I promise, but I think diagramming should be part of every basic course in typography. In 1976, Stevie Wonder released the amazing Songs in the Key of Life. Just 2 years later, my grade school released the less amazing Songs of Life. His was the critically acclaimed culmination of his classic album period. Mine was a bunch of caterwauling grade schoolers singing Bible stories and anti-abortion themes. This, unfortunately, was my first professional lettering job. Strangely, it did not lead to more professional work, but I'm sure the style will soon be made into a font by hobbyists somewhere. And here I am, seated at the right hand of the sun. Chuck. In the late 1970s, my father discovered a working Ludlow machine at a local print shop, and he did what any proud father with a working knowledge of metal type would do. He set the names of his wife and 6 children. Mine, not pictured, said Chuck. My father is the only one who calls me Chuck. Again, Christmas is only 9 months away. Has a child on your list been particularly naughty? Consider, very carefully, a slug of lead. But seriously, don't give lead to children. And stay in school. Don't do drugs. In the 7th grade, my teacher, Mr. Becker, was a hippie. Imagine Bob Ross with glasses. He decided it would be a good idea to let me teach art class. So I asked a bunch of hormonal 7th graders to transform a photograph into a high contrast image. I then asked them to convert that image into ASCII art using a manual typewriter. Here you see a very close approximation of the example that I gave to them. The results, to put it mildly, were underwhelming. It would be a full 10 years before I was asked to teach again. Nuclear Tann was the name of my punk slash post-punk slash new wave band in high school. Here you can see me, there's a vampire sneaking up behind me, but I'm playing guitar. 4 years later, my post-post-punk band, called Enormous, played CBGBs. Despite my incredible musical success and my amazing skills as a guitarist, and what I can only imagine was a looming, lucrative recording contract, I chose a career in typography. New York, 1984. My first job was long before 1984. It was in the 7th grade. I recorded the collections for the Catholic Church. You gave money, I kept track of it. As a teenager, I worked construction after school and in the summers to save money to go to art school in New York City. There is nothing like manual labor in your teens to convince you that you don't want to do manual labor later in life. At 16, I spent the summer in a dingy Brooklyn at Pratt Institute. At 17, I left home for good for the Cooper Union in a dingy Manhattan. The moral of this story is that the Cooper Union had the best letterhead ever, and that you can't control a child who has his own money. At Cooper, painting and drawing had moved away from the academic tradition and were still somewhat out of step with the New York gallery scene, but graphic design, and specifically typography, was on point. Ellen Lupton had just launched the Llewellyn Center, and a parade of thoughtful and inspiring exhibitions followed. Language-based design and typography were the new art. At Cooper Union, I was adopted by 3 mentors: George Sadek, who taught me how to design, Don Koons, who taught me calligraphy and the discipline of mark making, and William Bevington, who gave joy to typography. George hated Don, and Don didn't like George, and William was stuck in the middle. The phototypositor was a desktop darkroom for setting headlines. A light projected through a negative onto a strip of photographic paper that was constantly bathed in developer. Work had to be completed very quickly or the paper would turn gray from overexposure. It was a large, bizarre, archaic camera with limited functionality. I loved this machine. It was faster than sending type to a typesetter, more accurate than Letraset, and it had hundreds of typefaces that fit on tiny film negatives in a 3-ring binder. I quickly went from using it to hacking it, and over the course of my sophomore year, I photographed dozens of typographic animals. Like most hacking, it was less about making something useful and more about grabbing trophies. Deep impressions. Sort of a Jack Handy thing. I learned to print letterpress on a Vandercook proofing press. Vandercook proofing press from the amazing Dicko Faust. I am part of a generation that swoons over the deep bite into paper, much to my father's chagrin. My father's ideal of letterpress printing is a perfectly packed roller with level, cleanly inked type that barely kisses the surface of the paper. His was the end of a centuries-long pursuit of bringing type level with the surface of the paper. Mine viewed letterpress as a charming craft, like knitting or making your own beer. As a student, I had heard stories about how Optima created 2 camps at Cooper Union. Students loved it. Instructors hated it. I thought the idea of a typeface like Optima being divisive was absurd. Then the first emigre specimens arrived. George Sadek tossed them on my desk and he said, "This is fucking shit." And then Neville Brody's book came, and then Beowulf. And somehow the idea of typefaces as generational wedges seemed far less absurd. George Sadek, a Czech emigre, took to swearing in English the way Eric Gill took to Catholicism, with the passion of a convert. His chief design advice was direct and profane. "Jesus Christ, kid, read the fucking text." His technique, later dubbed lunacy over logic by Tom Klupfel, was simple. Read the text, let it reveal the concept, set it perfectly, and then do something unexpected or wrong. And George said about this last bit, it will drive them fucking crazy. I wish I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day so I could get his timbre, but alas. To pay rent during college, I worked evenings setting headlines on a large phototypositor in a dark room at a New York shop called Latent Lettering. It was a shop of slim repute. But three of us sat in a small red-lit room from 4 to midnight, cranking out headlines from large type negatives on a sort of reel-to-reel system. While art directors ate their dinners and tucked their children into bed, we blasted WBLS and spaced dozens of disembodied phrases in scores of different typefaces. Tight, not touching. The Macintosh was not part of my college education. For a moment of zen, and you can do this right now if you want, close your eyes and imagine a design program without computers or the internet. Okay, open your eyes. Production for design before the Mac was, to put it mildly, excruciatingly time-consuming. Early in my professional career, the Macintosh saved me tons of time. I spent that time at the library, reading every available book about typography. Brimming with newfound typographic knowledge, I became insufferable, and was soon offered a teaching position at Parsons School of Design, where I've taught for 2.5 decades. I have one regret from that typo reading binge. I wish I had read Jan Tschikold's Asymmetric Typography long before I read Stanley Morrison's First Principles. For a pragmatic mind, a full meal of the new typography should precede a stiff dose of Renaissance revival. But in the end, Tschikold arrived at the same place. So it's all water under the hammersmith. In 1989, I read Origin of the Serif, and it changed my life. Your results may vary. My first digital lettering and typeface design were part of a freelance project for conceptual artist Hans Hacke. Some background. In a bizarre deal, the US government agreed to rent the Bill of Rights to tobacco giant Philip Morris for promotional purposes. This was a bizarre deal by 1989 standards. Hans Hacke connected the dots between North Carolina-based Philip Morris and anti-art funding North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms in a project called Helmsborough. I did the Marlboro-style lettering on the giant box, and I digitized Consort Bold Condensed, the advertising typeface for Marlboros. Around the same time, you can't see from this crappy little photo, but I digitized Element, the quintessential Nazi typeface, for use in a number of Hans Hacke's works in Germany and the United States. Drink it in. Piss and vinegar. My first college teaching experience was as a calligraphy assistant to Don Koons. I was, to borrow my grandfather's phrase, full of piss and vinegar, filled with untempered passion. But there's a lot of waiting around in calligraphy instruction. Luckily, Paul Standard had left an entire flat file full of typographic ephemera and type specimens from Europe and America. These are not them. They were beautiful examples of letterpress printing. I studied the cuts and colors. They were so much livelier than anything I had seen out of photo or digital typesetting. I wanted that type. Early on, digital versions of the classic metal faces were crisp shadows of the originals. They were generally thinner, robbed of the squeeze of the press, and numbingly regular. I wanted my digital type to look as vibrant as those specimens from 30 and 40 years before. Henry Louis Bullen had an abiding love of type and a strong mustache game. In the early 20th century, he assembled a choice typographic library at the American Type Founders headquarters in Jersey City. D.B. Updike, on the right here, relied heavily on that library when he was writing printing types. When the ATF closed, the library went to Columbia University, where you can visit it today. The ATF shelves which held the Bullen ATF Library, ended up at Linotype in Brooklyn, and then Linotype Hell in Hauppauge. This is not the actual building, but it gets the point across. When Linotype Hell moved to Germany, the shelves went to the Type Directors Club. When the TDC moved, the shelves came to me. Just before I joined Monotype, the shelves moved to their present location in the studio of talented typographer and fellow TDC chairman Graham Clifford, who's not here right now. He'll be here for drinks later, and it's his birthday, so surprise him. In my typographic reading, I had seen several mentions of a book by Gabrielle Wells, designed by Bruce Rogers, entitled A Noble Fragment. Each copy contained a single leaf of the Gutenberg Bible. In 1990, I visited the Linotype Hell offices in Hauppauge with George Sadek, and there, in Steve Byer's office, on the old ATF shelves, was a copy of the Noble Fragment. Steve let me borrow it. I made scans and prints of the Bible page, which George Sadek sent to Czech artist Jiří Collage. You can just drink that name in. He's a collage artist named Jiří Collage. Collage created a series of collages to illustrate a text by Václav Havel. The text and the collages became a book in 1991. A Word About Words was George's final project before retiring from the Cooper Union. Havel amplified George's ideas about language and design. All the important events in the world, whether admirable or monstrous, always have their prologue in the realm of words. That very same year, Paul Standard died. A small memorial was held in a black curtained workroom at Eagle Typographers in New York, in the same building where 3 years earlier I had been setting headlines. Don Koons took me there to pay respects and to meet Herman Zapf. In his eulogy, Zapf remembered coming to America as a young man with no place to stay and no clear plan other than to meet American typographers and calligraphers. He ended up on Paul's doorstep. Paul gave him a couch to sleep on and opened his library. Zapf talked about the tiny pieces of precise calligraphic notation in the margins of all of the books, but mostly about Standard's kindness, his generosity and friendship. He grew quiet and choked back tears as he quietly closed his remarks. This was Paul. And this is the family of typography we're all part of. A generous lot, knowledgeable, supportive, and bound by filial piety. Sure, there are some cranks. Every family has a few surly aunts and uncles, but we're all related by our love of letters. In 1995, I convinced my two best friends, both very talented illustrators, to start a design for publishing company. Steve Arcella, Jan Schoenherr, and Charles Nix. Together, we were sick. We lived in Jan's old family home in Woodside. We ate together, we drank together, we had dinner parties with scintillating and stupid conversation. And we designed and illustrated dozens of books and covers. It didn't seem like an artist collective or a commune at the time, but as I tell the story, well, let's move along. In 1999, SICK published a book by our friend Carl Zimmer, a biography called The Rift Lake. I had wanted to use Electra, but found the digital version available then from Bitstream was one of those crisp shadows. I decided instead that I would digitize Dwiggen's Eldorado typeface, keeping all of the bone and muscle of the metal version. In the old publishing tradition, I named it Rift, after the book in which it first appeared. I am a patient man. And it's no coincidence that I was the longest associate of type designer George Abrams. George was talented but cantankerous. I won't discuss his typographic scruples, but I will say that his skill as a lettering artist was truly phenomenal. We completed 2 type families together, his Garamond, called Abrams Augereau, and a reworking of his Abrams Venetian. I'll go back so you can see the difference. Ojiro, Venetian. In 1997, at A-Type I in Reading, I presented a talk about George Abrams and his Ojiro. There, I met Carol Waller, or rather was pulled in, like so many others, to Carol's orbit, and so began my 20-year association with the TDC. Carol was then, and remains, the club's primary recruitment tool. She is the heart and soul of the Type Directors Club, and without her, we wouldn't be here today. Also in '97, I left the Sikh commune to chair a communication design program at the Parsons affiliate in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Within a week of arriving, their currency had collapsed. Monkeys were falling from trees from the smoke of 1,000 forest fires, and extremists had called for the death of Americans living in KL. I stayed. And from there I traveled to Samosir, a small island in the middle of a large volcanic lake in the middle of the much larger island of Sumatra. There, in a tiny village called Tuk Tuk, I did what vacationing typographers do. I took photographs and made sketches of the lettering. And back in KL, I worked the sketches into drawings and made a series of display fonts. These were drawings prepared for Icarus. Crazy. No, those were the sketches. These are the drawings. Not good enough, actually. The common cuckoo lays its eggs in the nests of other birds. When I look at these typefaces now, I empathize with the warbler that returns to its nest and finds a strange, large bird screaming for food. Caslon, the Matchmaker. In 1999, George and I began working on a third family, Abrams Caslon. While I was off fighting in the colonies, George had hired a young woman to digitize his drawings. I returned to supervise. I fell deeply in love with that woman, and after an embarrassingly long courtship, we got married. The typeface was never released, but Michelle and I have 2 beautiful children and a good type geek origin story, brought together by Caslon. That same year, I attended a TDC lecture by James Montalbano at SVA. He was speaking about his Clearview Highway typeface, a topic I was keenly interested in since, at the time, I was reading the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices from the US Transportation Department, which everyone, and by everyone I mean no one, was doing at the time. James graciously/ironically signed it for me, and we became friends. And later, I began designing his type specimens. And it was James who 2 years ago connected me with Monotype. I became the chair of communication design at Parsons in 2002. It involved a lot of meetings, and meetings about those meetings, and then making charts about the meetings, and more meetings. I did manage, however, to institute a type design track of calligraphy, digital lettering, and type design. And I hired Maxim Zhukov, Peter Bain, Paul Shaw, and James Montalbano to teach it, which is, it's New York City, it's so incredible. Convinced by the endless meetings that there was a better way for me to spend my time, and sorely missing design, I left the chairmanship in 2005. However, this January, James Montalbano began teaching his 25th semester of type design at Parsons. So congratulations to Parsons and to James. All the stars in the sky. When I left Parsons, editor George Scott and I founded a science and nature publishing company. I have charted the night sky in various forms a dozen times. I've designed the birds of the world, the trout and salmon of North America, butterflies, trees, more birds, mayflies, vascular plants, herbals, more birds, and a field guide to American whiskey. It was during what I think was my 10th book about the birds of North America that I left to join Monotype. I served as the president of the Type Directors Club from 2008 to 2010. During that time, I met Massimo at a presentation by Paul Shaw. I just happened to have a copy of my 1972 proposed subway map with me, which he graciously signed. We talked about our mutual friend George Sadek and the 1979 Aspen Conference themed the Italian idea, for which George had designed this poster. I floated to Massimo an idea of a TDC Night of the Italians, and he bought in. With Vignelli in the mix, it was easy to rope in Louise, Matteo, Francesco Cavalli, and Paolo Antonelli from MoMA. That event, held in this very auditorium, was a high point of my time with the TDC board. It exemplified the collegial nature of the club and why it's great to be a designer in New York. And thanks to Louise, we all had gelato. Three years ago, James Montalbano asked me to design the Terminal Font Design Catalog, Terminal Font Catalog. James is, of course, probably no mystery to people here, quietly one of the most prolific and talented American type designers working today, so the material was choice. I hatched a plan I called Recast, wherein I would recast typographic milestones using James's typefaces. From Gutenberg to Baskerville, from Morris to Marinetti, Dada de Still, Bauhaus to Zwart, I recast for about 6 months. So much time. I mean, I love these, but they took forever. Then one day, well, it sort of hit me. This was not a good solution. It was a lot of fun, and I really loved the pieces, but it wasn't a good way to show off the typefaces. So I sheepishly admitted that to James, and he agreed, and we scrapped the entire thing. A year later, we cast and printed a much smarter catalog, which I urge you to get a copy of. This is a story to reaffirm your faith in the power of typography, and it begins as most of my stories do not. Last year, while speeding down the Gardner Expressway outside of Toronto, Alan Haley, Patrick Griffin, Matthew Carter, and I were talking type. Matthew naturally had the best stories, and the best of those was about his time at Enschede after World War II. The Enschede workers, he said, were proud to show off the false walls and hidden workrooms where, during the war, they forged documents to help Jews escape Nazi occupation. Matthew told us this story in the rosy days before the election. Then, it seemed like a heartwarming history lesson. Today, it seems like a challenge or a call to action. I beg your pardon, because I'm about to get very small. I'm irritated by certain typographic conflations, like principles of text typography being misused or misquoted towards display type and vice versa. And lettering, especially illustrated lettering, being taken for typography. Trust. I love lettering, but it is not typography. It is lettering. Perhaps one day soon the skies will open and I'll be visited by a revelation that display type and text type, they're not really so different, and that all letters are brethren and that all are typography. Until then, I remain somewhat annoyed. Ed touched on this one earlier. For me, design is a verb. It is a process. The work of others is a product. It's a noun. And that is why I see my work as deeply flawed, while I see the work of others as charmingly idiosyncratic. That's pretty much my philosophy. MoMA curator Paola Antonelli has a theory that utopia is quite near at hand. It arrives when we embrace fluidity, contradiction, and ambiguity. This design is a work in progress called ambiguity, in a response to that idea. Historical diagrams group capitals into two basic widths. With a little imagination, the lowercase can be similarly grouped. By width, wide forms, and slender forms. Ambiguity reverses these proportions in the uppercase and in the lowercase. Wide forms are condensed, and slender forms are extended. Ambiguity assigns these widths to stylistic sets. Unadulterated, it presents a basic humanist skeleton. But stylistic set 1 contains the slender forms, and stylistic set 2 contains the wide forms, and applying both stylistic sets reverses the expectations. Here, without stylistic sets, stylistic set 1, stylistic set 2, and stylistic set, water. In the corner there, stylistic sets 1 and 2 combined. And here mixing alternate forms. Hope is my first, well, it should be my first monotype font release. It's a mashup of mid-century hand-lettered advertising sans style and the prolific swashes from Bookman. I gave it the working title Hope, named after my grandfather, Hope Nix, that's truly his name, and my wife's grandfather, Hope Lee, truly his name, born 25 years apart and 8,000 miles apart, but joined together in our children. Hope, the typeface, is currently 4 weights with accompanying italics and has an extensive set of Latin characters and complete Cyrillic coverage. It contains nearly a dozen stylistic sets with varying degrees of swashiness. That's the basic character set. Oh, I'll end with 2 bits of typographic hero worship. In 1989, ITC had a show of W.A. Dwiggen's work, organized by Dorothy Abbey, Louise Feely, and Stephen Heller. It was around then that I began collecting his work. He was a typographic genius. Blindingly prolific, he had, by most standards, a complete career as a book designer, an illustrator and advertising artist, a writer, a type designer, and a puppeteer. Bradbury Thompson practiced typographic history, form, and use with his unique vision and voice for over 50 years. He is one of 25 typographers in the last 70, is it 25 or 29? 29 typographers in the last 70 years to have been awarded the TDC medal. He had a natural feel for text typography and reveled in type for display. His work is expressive, erudite, experimental, rational, humble, consistent, and kind. He is my ideal typographer. Number 1. I end my first and final classes by saying to the students, I love you all very much, and when I'm not with you, my heart aches, which is only half false. We're here today because we love typography, and we love typography because it communicates, and we are good. The Type Directors Club, through its exhibition, its annual and the TDC medal, delivers a definitive version of the typographic trinity. Superb examples of typographic form via the type design competition, excellent examples of typographic use via the main competition, and every year for the past 70 years, it has written another chapter in the history of typography. Congratulations to the TDC, and thank you. I think I told you everything you need to know, so. Q&A? Okay. Any questions?
Charles, over here to your right. Just wondering if you could say a little bit more about Father Edward Kaddish's Origin of the Serif and how that was such an epiphany for you.
The teachers of typography that I had at Cooper Union were inspirational. Kaddish, the way he talked about the origin of the serif and the sort of the insight he gives in that book into the origins of the capitals as we know them today was eye-opening and not part that level of detail was not part of a typography education as I knew it. But it completely changed the way that I thought about serifs. I mean, it sounds. Don't know whether it's geeky or nerdy, but it doesn't matter. It sounds so peculiar to be so struck by something like that, but it was amazing. He was amazing, and the book is lucid and beautiful, and it changed the way that I thought about typography. So there, I explained it. I said I wouldn't explain it, but there I did. Any other questions? Aquarius. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
You should really explain what Kachi's theory was, because some people might not know.
All right. Right. So we were taught in art history that the origin of the serif was the stonemason. What Kaddish proved, I think, beyond a shadow of a doubt in Origin of the Serif was that the origin of the serif was the sign painter, the edging in of with a brush, or later with a nib of calligraphy. It was essentially a remnant of the motion of getting the ink or pigment flowing onto the surface, and that you could essentially carve whatever you wanted. I mean, the history of art shows us that. But the making of letters was something born of brush and not from.
Or type comes from movement, contrast and rhythm.
Amen.
Okay. Do you have any questions for Eric?
I'm aware there's students in the room who might not have learned Kachi's work by heart, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it was deliberately sing-songy and short here. These are all, I could talk, unfortunately, for hours about each of these stories, but...
Please don't.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Wise ass.
How was your experience as president of the Typewriters Club? What did it mean to you?
It's a double-edged sword. It takes a lot of time, but at the same time, it's like it takes time, like, you know, being with your family takes time. You do put in time. Some of it's enjoyable, some of it's ecstatic, but a lot of it's simply time.
When was ecstatic?
Night of the Italians, free gelato. Come on, working with Carol, of course. Massimo, just spending time with Massimo. Mike Parker was, in his patrician way, just so charming beyond belief and so knowledgeable. Amazing. Yeah. So it's people, meeting people. Any other questions? Not from Matteo? There's one more.
Hello. You seem to have been very focused on typography in your career, but you've covered a lot of kind of various experiences, and I was wondering if there was any stream running through your life that was kind of guiding you, or was it kind of one thing in response to the next and to the next?
About 20 years ago, I met with somebody who asked me that same question, and it was punctuated by this question at the end, which was, if you could do anything in life, what would it be? And I said, I would like to spend my day designing typefaces and spend my evenings fly fishing. Now I, every day, spend my life designing type, which is crazy, just crazy great for me. That is the thread. That's the thing that it's all been aiming at. But I'm not a type designer as like somebody so sort of in love with form or creating fonts. I am a typographer. I used fonts for what is now a 30-year-long career in designing books. So I know what I want from my type, and now I'm crafting it. I showed you 2 typefaces, including this one. Ambiguity is more of a thought experiment than an actual typeface. It will never be released into the wild, but this one will. And yeah, I'm just making type. What's the thread, though, that goes through it? I don't know. You can't escape
thread.
your parents.
Thanks.
Douglas?
Why should designers learn to diagram sentences?
It's important to know grammar so that you know where to put the emphasis. That's it. Yeah. And on that note, on that joke,